So this really has been a disastrous 12 months for Iran at a time when its economy is doing extremely badly. It's discombobulated also by the election of President Trump.
Iran's supreme leader has claimed that the US and Israel orchestrated the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria and the subsequent ousting of Iran from the country. Now, the events in Syria have fundamentally changed the balance of power in the Middle East, and it's being seen as quite the geopolitical headache for the mullahs in Tehran. With me now in the studio, former British ambassador to Iran, Sir Simon Gass. Sir Simon, good afternoon to you.
Hello, Jane. Good to be here.
Well, it's really good to have you in the studio. First of all, what will they be thinking in Tehran about what's happened in the last week?
Well, I think Iran will be putting it into context of a really bad year that they have had. After all, a lot of Iran's ability to project power overseas was based on the influence it had with proxies like Hezbollah and with friendly regimes in the region, like the Syrian regime of Assad, which they propped up along with the Russians. And what we've seen happen over the last 12 months or so is that all of these proxies and supporters have just been demolished one after another. Hezbollah, of course, by military action from Israel in an extraordinary series of events there. But now we've seen the absolutely astonishingly fast collapse of the Assad regime in Syria, which was an absolute keystone to Iran's national security policy, because not only was it a friendly regime in the region, but it also acted as a conduit, a sort of passageway by which Iran could get weapons to Hezbollah, which it regarded as its most important proxy. So this really has been a disastrous 12 months for Iran at a time when its economy is doing extremely badly. It's discombobulated also by the election of President Trump, who they recall took action against Iran by assassinating General Soleimani, the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. And they will be quite fearful, I think, about what President Trump might do in terms of putting more pressure on Iran in future.
Right, can I interrupt you just to ask, what might Iran do before Donald Trump can do anything?
Well, I think Iran faces two broad choices, Jane. One, and we see more discussion of this in Iran, and we have done for the last few months, is would Iran press ahead and try to get a nuclear weapon? We know, of course, that they've had a large nuclear program for many years. They've stopped short of turning it into a nuclear weapon, and that isn't an easy thing for them to do, by the way, to manufacture a weapon. But there is an argument which says, well, if so many of your fences have been knocked down by Israel or by rebels in Syria, maybe what you need is a nice big deterrent to stop anybody getting ideas about toppling the Iranian regime, and therefore a nuclear weapon might be the answer.
So a wounded and vulnerable feeling Iran possibly poses more of a threat to us than it did 6 months ago.
Well, it could do, because I've set out one option, but there is another option which says actually Iran is going to know that it's going to have to do a deal now, that it's lost so much authority that it will have to reach some sort of agreement with the Americans, which allows sanctions relief in return for really repudiating a nuclear weapon. And of course, in some senses, that sounds counterintuitive. After all, Donald Trump is a person who's put huge pressure on Iran, but he has said that he thinks there could be a deal with Iran. And from the Iranian point of view, the difficulty always with doing a deal with the Democrats was that they knew that as soon as there was a Republican administration, it would go up in smoke. So that wasn't very attractive. So in some ways, if they could do a deal with a Republican president, that might actually be better for them. So I think there are two ways this could go, one of which is a lot more dangerous, one of which is more benign.
OK, well, let's hope it's the benign option, obviously. So. But the Iranian regime, I'm going to talk to Bill Browder, I should say that conversation's already been recorded, about whether it's possible that Putin could be on the brink, if not now, perhaps in the next couple of years. Surely the Iranian regime isn't one that we can assume will still be there in a year's time, 2 years' time.
I think the problem with that is that I've been involved in affairs in Iran for well over a decade now, And people have been predicting the collapse or replacement of the Iranian regime for a very long time. And indeed, when I was ambassador in Tehran in 2009, we saw massive marches through Tehran, the Green Revolution. And I saw how it was crushed by Iran's security forces in the most ruthless and unpleasant way. I think that at the moment, the Iranian regime is not as insecure as you might suppose, simply because it will apply massive force and is well used to doing so. And many Iranians who I spoke to at the time said, look, what we don't want is another repeat of the 1979 Iranian Revolution, because that turned out so badly for us, and we don't want our young children being killed on the streets only to open up a new uncertainty in the future. What we want is progressive change in Iran. So I'm not saying that this couldn't happen,
No.
but I don't think this is something which is imminent. My last point, though, is that all of that said, look at how quickly Syria fell once it started to go.
I was going to ask you if we'd had this conversation this time last week and I'd said to you, do you think President Assad's in any danger? What would you have said?
You're absolutely right. Nobody would have predicted that. But of course, one difference is that in Syria, there were very well-armed opposition forces who were able to take advantage of Assad's weakness. There are no such substantial forces in Iran opposed to the regime. So it's quite a different picture.
I was going to say that Iran, in terms of the way it treats women, is not quite as bad as Afghanistan. I mean, it's such a ridiculous thing to say, but actually it isn't quite as bad, although it does operate a form of gender apartheid. And they are tightening the restrictions on women, aren't they, the Iranian regime?
These restrictions are sometimes tightened and sometimes loosened in Iran. It goes in phases depending on what signals the regime wants to send. But for the supreme leader in Iran, I fear that issues like wearing the hijab are so bound up in his mind with the continuation of the Islamic revolution, the Iranian revolution, which is absolutely what the regime stands for, that they will not loosen those controls willingly.
Right. And to Syria then, we are still in a state of absolute flux. I understand that the parliament's going to be suspended for a period of a couple of months. We don't really know what HTS actually stands for or what they'll be like in government. What's your gut feeling?
Well, I wish I could be sunnily optimistic, Jane, but to be frank, I'm not. I hope that I will be proven wrong. But firstly, one mustn't forget that HTS, as you say, the main force that toppled Assad, their roots were in Al-Qaeda. These are, many of them, quite extreme in their fundamentalist, Salafist views. Now, you're absolutely right that Abu Muhammad al-Jilani, the leader of the revolution, who of course fought against the Americans and was imprisoned by the Americans in Iraq, is now saying, don't worry everybody, we've changed our minds, reassurance to all of the minorities, we'll look after everybody. He may mean that, I simply don't know. But if you look at the history of the Middle East and what tends to happen when autocratic regimes are toppled, the picture is not terribly encouraging. If you think of Libya, if you think of what happened in Iraq after the fall of Saddam Hussein, if you think of actually the 1979 Iranian Revolution we were talking about, these things don't always go well. And even assuming that he is committed to what he says, it will be a fiendishly difficult job to balance the patchwork of religious differences, ethnic differences, groups that are backed by external players in different parts of the country. This would be a fiendishly difficult job for even the best intentioned of governments, particularly at a time when the Syrian economy is frankly shot to pieces. So I hope this turns out well. Nobody will mourn the passing of Assad, who was a complete butcher, but I have hope rather than expectation that this will turn out tremendously well for the people of Syria.
I've just been told in my headphones that the NATO Secretary General has said that NATO should move to a wartime footing. We are trying to be optimistic. Apparently, he's just said we are not ready for what is coming our way.
Well, I suspect he's probably not referring to Syria
I
specifically.
think he was referring to Russia, although
To Russia, exactly. That's
interestingly,
what I would expect.
In the conversation I'm about to have, or you're about to hear with
Yes.
Bill Browder, he's relatively optimistic and says he doesn't think Russia could fight a world war, or certainly not a war with the West.
I'm a bit closer to Bill Browder on this one, not because I don't think that there is a very dangerous threat. I do. And if you look at what Russia is doing in terms of covert action in Europe, that alone is incredibly threatening to our countries. I don't myself think that Putin plans a war in which he's going to go from Ukraine to Poland or the Baltic states. I don't think that. But under any circumstances, where I agree with the NATO Secretary General, is that whatever the outcome may be in Ukraine, we will face a Russia which is possessed of massive military force. It's putting 6% GDP into its defence industry at the moment, which buys a lot more than it would buy in Europe, by the way. He does have multiple nuclear weapons, and he is fundamentally antagonistic, not only to Europe, but also to the political systems which our countries represent. So I do think there's a significant danger. And I think if what the NATO Secretary General is saying is that our countries need to get even more serious about defence capability than they have in the past, then I'm absolutely with him. And that is really tough when we're trying to fund the NHS and schools and everything else. I understand that. But the threat from Russia to Europe is only going to grow, in my view.